My name is Keith Morey, and today we're going to talk about MSM and why it's the third most powerful product in the world. Three things occur when you get older. You become dehydrated, you look like a prune, become insulin resistant, and you become inflexible. You become like an old person walking really slow. Why is that? Why do we change so rapidly? And I'm going to say most of that's caused from a lack of sulfur. And MSM is 34% sulfur. So let me explain. Sulfur is the third most used chemical in the body. Methionine, cysteine, trizine, glutathione, lipoic acid, biotin are all sulfur compounds, and they're mainly for detoxification. So the first line of defense of the body is to detoxify, because if it lets it sit there, it will do long-term damage if it doesn't get rid of it right away. So it will detoxify before it hydrates. Why do we become dehydrated? Is because the cells have all these what they call potassium sodium pumps. They're little pumps that pump fluid in with nutrition and waste material out of the cell. But as we get older and we have a lack of sulfur, the cells shrink. They start to trap waste material in the cell, and so they can eliminate, and it gets trapped and can eliminate the waste material, so the cell starts to degrade, starts to malfunction, and eventually damages the DNA, and we have an aging cell, and you become old. But sulfur is what helps the ionic exchange between the potassium and sodium. And the reason we have a lack of sulfur is, first, in our food supply, there's less sulfur than we had 200 years ago. Second is we cook our food. And when we cook our food, sulfur is very volatile. It evaporates. And we cook a lot more than we did 200 years ago. So we have less sulfur in our food. We have more cooking, which depletes the sulfur base. And then we have more air pollution and food pollution, which utilizes the sulfur to detox and remove those waste materials, all these pesticides and poisons and chemicals that are in our food supply that the body doesn't want anymore, doesn't want it to start with. So we're poisoning ourselves, and sulfur is taking the blunt of that. So because the cell needs sulfur to help the ionic exchange, it starts to shrink, in turn trapping waste material, causing the cell to malfunction. Now, MSM is 34% sulfur. And sulfur, as we talked about, is the third most used chemical. So when you start to take a lot of sulfur, MSM, you start to rehydrate the cells. You start to allow more food and nutrition into the cell, and it actually starts to allow the waste material trapped to be removed from the cell, opening up receptor sites, allowing glucose and insulin and other chemicals to be better utilized by the cell. This is only half the issue. The other half is flexibility. So when you bond proteins, you need what they call a disulfonyl bond, a double sulfur bond. That means it's like a hinge. If you don't have enough sulfur, you get what they call a rigid bond. A good example would be a weightlifter. Walks around, can't touch his ear. You think he's muscle bound, but he's actually sulfur deficient. Because when he weightlifts, he creates what they call lactic acid. And the first line of defense, as I mentioned before, is to remove waste material. So it uses all its sulfur compounds to remove the waste material. So when it goes to make the new muscle tissue, it becomes rigid instead of flexible. And that's why they're tearing hamstrings and ligaments and tendons, because they have a lack of sulfur. So now you know why MSM is the third most powerful product in the world for overall health, because it detoxifies the cell, it hydrates the cell, and it makes the cell or other cells that bond to it more flexible so you have less damage to your